Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Raphael, I think we'll wait on call 2 minutes or so to let people in.
Yeah, you're the chair, so you make the decisions.
We should have 3 minutes break between the talks. So, okay. And I think, yeah, okay. So now we enter the official part of the last day of this great workshop with, in the first place, a talk by Don Ross on naturalistic versus analytic social ontology. So Don, please just go ahead. And then after about 40 minutes, I guess we'll move to the discussion for about 15 to 20 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much. And let me just start by thanking the organizers for this workshop. I've found it really interesting and stimulating and fun. So very good service getting us all together here. I've got quite a few slides here, probably too many, so I'll appreciate if Michelle, I'll try to keep an eye on the time, but if Michelle cuts me off, I'll appreciate that. That'll be fine. The paper that I pre-circulated is quite long, and it's quite dialectical in its structure, so hard to transfer into PowerPoint mode. I therefore haven't really tried. I've prepared some slides, but I filtered out quite a bit of the details from the paper, and there's whole areas the paper goes into that I don't even touch on here. So if you happen to have had a chance to read the paper in advance, you'll be a bit better equipped for this, but if you haven't, you haven't. Let me just stop clearing my throat and get straight into it. All right, so this first slide, I want to understand, this is, what I'm doing here is stipulative, not descriptive. So I'm not trying to tell you what analytic metaphysics is or what naturalistic metaphysics is. This slide is about just how to understand when I use those terms in this presentation. So I'm going to understand analytic metaphysics pretty closely by reference to my foil for these purposes, Brian Epstein's book on the Ant Trap. So I'm going to understand that analytic metaphysics as a refinement using some standard elements in a toolbox, modal logic and semantic theory of traditional metaphysics, which is a priori with respect to science, not in the sense that the constraints it provides are a priori. That doesn't mean necessarily independent of being influenced by scientific knowledge, but in an application, they are a priori because they help to structure the way we understand the application of the science and the scientific theory. And crucially, such metaphysics distinguishes causal relationships from constitutive relationships, metaphysically constitutive relationships, and it focuses on grounding relations to specify particular instances of constitution, both of types and tokens. A naturalized metaphysics, rather than read this thing, which will be pretty familiar to most people, you'll see naturalistic metaphysics emerge because the second half of the talk is about it. So I won't say everything twice and foreshadow here. One crucial point I will take out of this box. James and I in our book refer to fundamental physics. Now we say in the book that we have a particular interpretation of fundamental, which is not the standard one in analytic philosophy, but we should apologize, I think, for having used that word. It's just caused lots of confusion. So James and I have a new recently adopted policy that we say universal physics now instead of fundamental physics, and that's what I'll say here. That's the word the word I'll use in this talk. And of course, I've set things up in such a way that I'm understanding analytic metaphysics and our version of naturalized metaphysics as limit points. I mean, I'm taking pretty extreme versions of them so that I can understand most metaphysics as falling in between, most metaphysics as allowing for allowing for influence from scientific theory, but also influence from folk ontology and logic and perhaps conceptual intuitions, and not being, with lots of variation from one philosopher to another about exactly how all those elements are put into the soup. The slide doesn't want to advance. Why? There we go. All right, now our topic here is there a metaphysics of social science? And if so, what is it? Whoops. In our book, James and I mostly are focused on physics. That is, we take a certain account of the ontology of physics as our base camp, and then we go on to ask, given that ontology of physics, how can we understand special sciences as perhaps saying true things about reality, the same reality addressed by the universal physics? Right? Is there a story we can tell that can explain how that can be? Now, one of the advantages of starting, we of course, we don't view physics as fundamental in the metaphysical sense. The reason we focus on physics is partly because it's universal, partly because it has a special place in the scientific, in the sociology of science, but also because it's easier, I think, to do ontology, of our kind at least, in physics, because physicists can disengage from folk and logic-based ontologies. Now, they don't, of course, all do so. It's a controversy within philosophy of physics whether they should do so, but it's possible for them to do so. And the main reason it's possible for them to do so is that ultimately the literal content of physics is mathematical, not right, and actually can't be fully expressed in natural language. In consequence of which, it's easier to read ontological commitments out of the theory, because one doesn't have to also deal with the issue of how to get around the metaphors that are deeply baked into all of natural language. Also, of course, physicists in the end of the day are just answerable to themselves. Social scientists, by contrast, are typically heavily motivated by policy concerns. So a social scientist cannot just disengage from natural language or from the folk ontology, because if they want to be policy relevant, they're ultimately going to be their way of conceiving the world is going to be driven by the way their clients conceive the world, and they've got to be able to serve their clients in presenting their work. So that's an important difference. And it leaves three general possibilities when we ask ourselves about what can metaphysics be expected to do or contribute to social science. One possibility is one could just say, well, metaphysics is irrelevant to social ontology, right? When we're in the domain of social science, just pragmatism should rule. Another possibility is maybe analytic metaphysics, even if, as per James and my argument in chapter 3 of our book, is inappropriate for physics, for physical theory, it might yet be a sound basis for social ontology because of the need for social ontology to engage with folk conceptions and to be conducted in natural language. Or then this is the view, this is my actual view, the view I defend, naturalized metaphysics can in fact shed light on the nature of social ontology, that is, on how it is that there is an ontology of the social in the world described by universal physics that's compatible with that world. But metaphysics should not play any role in populating the social ontology. So that is the view that's what I actually believe, right? That when it comes to populating the social ontology, metaphysics is irrelevant. All right, and I'm going to take as my foil here Brian Epstein's book, 2015 book, just because at least he does analytic metaphysics of the social in but has an agenda that engages with us, with my concerns. That is to say, Epstein doesn't take himself to just be trying to provide an ontology for ontology of the social, which is just answerable to metaphysical concerns. That is, sort of saying what a metaphysics of the social would be. He explicitly says this is intended to be a contribution to social science. And he says that social scientists are not making progress, notwithstanding the huge explosion of data quantity and quality that they have been enjoying thanks to new technology. They haven't been making progress. And he says the reason they haven't been making progress is because they're metaphysically confused. Now, I have to do some charitable interpretation of Epstein in order to use him as a foil, because as Bob Sugden has pointed out in his review of Brian's book in the Journal of Economic Literature, a remarkable feature of the book is that the only extended study of social science, the only case of social scientific failure that Epstein mentions in any detail is a terrible case. That is, he cites macroeconomists' failure to predict the 2008 crisis, which is a terrible example to choose because there's really no mystery at all about what went wrong there. Since what went wrong was at the juncture of macroeconomists' advice to central banks. And since whenever you give advice to central banks, everything is exhaustively documented in public, we know exactly, it's really easy to figure out what happened. And it had nothing to do with metaphysics. It was an institutional failure. It wasn't even a theoretical failure. It wasn't that economists it was something economists didn't know. It was that the structure of the relationship between theoretical economics and the clients was screwed up. So anyway, that's a bad example. And then furthermore, Epstein says that better metaphysics would generate better social science model, but never comments on what he takes models to be, social science models, nor shows us a single example of a model that would be repaired if one attended to his metaphysical concerns. So I need to charitably interpret the project. And that's what I will try to do. So Epstein has two main goals in the book. One is to alert social scientists that explaining facts about social kinds requires attention, not just to causes, but to constituting grounds of types and also some tokens when we care about them for some reason. And then his second goal is to refute what he calls the consensus view, which supports ontological individualism. And then he does some work to make sure we understand the difference between ontological individualism and the independent thesis and much weaker thesis of methodological individualism. It seems to me, just before we go on, I mean, these are his two goals. He spends about equal numbers of pages on the two. Of course, they're related. Goal 2 is easy, and goal 1 is hard, as we'll see. All right, what is the basic core of Epstein's effort here? The core of his program is to distinguish between, on the one hand, anchoring of social types. So these are empirical processes that generate social kinds. And there's no, in principle, limit to how complex or heterogeneous such empirical processes can be, right? There's lots of ways in which human beings generate social kinds, economic kinds and sociological kinds and institutions and functional things like money and, right? Of course, very different anchoring processes go into generating a formal institution from something as ubiquitous and complicated a functional thing as money on the or informal groups and so on. But now where the metaphysics starts is Epstein interprets anchoring processes as it's part of the philosopher's job to show how the anchoring processes are expressed as what Epstein calls framing principles. What the framing principles do, and of course we have to interpret practice and we have to interpret some explicit theory to figure out what they are, but what the framing principles in a sense do is tell us which ranges of possible worlds and which variables, which concepts across possible worlds, how much exactly which possible worlds and which dimensions of flexibility across possible worlds are relevant to fixing the grounding conditions for the social kind. And then, right, having fixed the frame principles, so we know what possible worlds we have to pay attention to and what dimensions of variation across possible worlds we have to pay attention to. We're then in a position to specify the grounding rules, which are the metaphysical rules of metaphysical constitution of the kind in question. And it's made metaphysical because of the nature of the framing principles. So it's metaphysical constitution, not contingent empirical constitution. And then Epstein's critique of social science is that social science models tend to muddle anchoring and grounding conditions together, the result of which is ontological chaos. And that's his criticism of social science. He thinks the reason he thinks models that social science isn't making better progress despite having so much data is because there's not enough stability in theory and across models. It's too hard, for example, to compare often one model against another to assess what difference it would make, which model is true, in part because the social scientists in question are too loose and casual about distinguishing the empirical anchoring conditions from the metaphysical grounding conditions. But again, we're not actually ever given any examples. So because we're not given any examples, I have to construct some methodological interpretation of the importance of grounding. I mean, Brian just doesn't say. So here we go, right? I'm trying to be charitable here, and I'm trying to act as a person who does, I mostly do empirical behavioral economics. I make models, I estimate them, and identify models in data. So I think to myself, what might I be not doing that Brian Epstein thinks I should be? Well, a social scientist typically has to measure proxy indicators of kinds, right? We don't typically measure the kinds directly, we measure some indicator of them. And often, of course, these are causal effects, but they might also be more reasonably interpreted as constituents. And then I think Epstein's idea is that constitutive proxies are safer proxies. They're better proxies for stabilizing cross-model reference because they don't vary across context, because the framing principles lock them down with respect to possible worlds. Here's an example. Epstein's proxy for the behavior of the US Supreme Court is the behavior of its 9 judges. In other words, if I want, one of the ways to track what the court's up to is track what those people are up to. And then the frame principles and the metaphysical grounds specify that, for example, Justice Kagan writing a majority opinion, the person, Justice Kagan, writing a majority opinion is an action of the court, while the action of the person, Justice Kagan, drinking a cup of coffee is not. And more controversially, and here I'm drawing directly on some examples Brian uses, Justice Kagan writing an opinion after she retires would not be an action of the court. And we get some thought experiments scattered through Brian's book, which I think are highly questionable, that he reads them tendentiously. He asks us, for example, what happens if Justice Kagan retires, but forgets that she's retired and writes an opinion? And suppose everybody forgets that she's retired. Well, says Brian, the framing principles and the grounding conditions will tell us that even though everyone thinks she's still is under the illusion that she's still on the Supreme Court, she's actually not. So everyone could be wrong, and that would not be an action of the court. I'm not persuaded at all by these kinds of counterexamples, and I might or might not have time to say why. Because otherwise it can be postponed till the question period. All right, so wait a minute, I went the wrong direction. All right, now I agree with Epstein about on a number of things he wants to argue. Again, he devotes much of the book to arguing against ontological individualism. I agree that is a false general claim. He argues that supervenience and emergence are inadequate tools for understanding the failure of ontological individualism. he thinks ultimately supervenience and emergence are really just accommodations of ontological individualism to some troublesome facts for the ontological individualist about properties of wholes versus properties of constituent parts and so on, familiar stuff. And then anyway, he argues social kinds don't supervene on individual people as a matter of fact. That's right, indeed. He points out that ontological individualism is frequently pernicious in its effects. Absolutely right. As Sally Haslinger was discussing nicely yesterday, several speakers have discussed, indeed it is. OI is bad, and importantly bad. He doesn't really, he's not so explicit on whether OI, he doesn't defend the idea that OI is a metaphysical thesis by reference to its historical philosophical origins. I suggest in the paper that he should. I mean, that's an important part of making the case about the metaphysical character of OI. I mean, we understand why some agents are politically motivated to defend OI, because it helps them suppress what for them would be a lot of inconvenient social facts. But I think there's part of the explanation of why OI has such a tenacious grip in Western cultures also needs to appeal to a metaphysical tradition, because after all, there's no shortage in non-Western cultures of defenders of oppressive status quos who go to plenty of political trouble to maintain their oppressive status quos, but don't have the resource of being able to really appeal to OI because OI doesn't make much sense in those cultures. And there's lots of empirical work and even some pretty good philosophical work by people like Owen Flanagan on the absence of OI in, for example, China. So that's just given that OI is available to politically motivated agents in America or Britain and not in China, suggests that the Western metaphysical tradition of atomism is actually an important part of the story of this cultural fact. And therefore, metaphysics is implicated. All right, but here I'm collapsing into one slide, what occupies probably a third of the words in the paper. So this is a really crash tour. That's because that part of the paper is quite dialectical. So here are my main criticisms of Epstein. First, that metaphysical grounds depend on metaphysical judgments of relative fundamentality. What in general, what sort of facts depend on which other sorts of facts? But like any pragmatist, my view is that there are no reliable, non-empirical, cross-contextual basis for fundamentality judgments. There are, of course, fundamentality judgments that get made in particular cases, but they're provisional. They follow science. They don't precede it. And ultimately, right, so when we reject metaphysical atomism, we're not rejecting metaphysical atomism as on the basis of quarreling with fundamentality judgments on metaphysical grounds. We reject atomism because we think it's incompatible with physics. And if it's incompatible with physics, it's just implausible in metaphysics. And Epstein's reliance on cases with explicit framing rules like the Supreme Court, right, obscures that problem, because where we have legal rules or regulations, typically those legal rules and regulations encode fundamentality judgments, and so will impose the fundamentality judgment across any instance where we're wondering about what is an action of the Supreme Court, for example, or what is not. It's by virtue of the legal rules, you're told that the judges, who the judges are, is more fundamental relative to other properties of the court, some other properties of the court, though not all other properties. Right, but in those cases, I would argue the cross-world rigidity, the plausibility of thinking that you know what the framing principles actually specify across possible worlds, is coming from the explicitness of the rules. right? Not necessarily, or I would dictate not from metaphysics, but because it's plausible that you really can fix cross-world identities and cross-world grounding conditions. In those cases, you can be kind of sucked into thinking that the story should work equally well for less explicit cases. But I think that with lots more time, I would work through some of Brian's cases and show I don't agree with his thought experiments, with his conclusions from his thought experiments. I don't think it works. The story works at all once we're outside of those explicit rule contexts. It's useful to, Brian again has no real case studies. The only one he does offer is this supposed failure of macroeconomists in 2008. I have a paragraph in the paper that actually says what happened, tries to say very quickly what we know happened there and why I've already indicated I think it's a terrible example. But we can segue from Brian's bad example to a better one. After all, it really, or a neighboring one, a closely related one, it's really true that economists struggle with aggregation problems. It really is puzzling how macroeconomic, in various ways, how macroeconomic models cohere with or relate to or occupy the same domain, share a domain with microeconomic models. There's lots and lots and lots of different ways economists have had to try to struggle with this problem. They basically, for the most part, just hack around it by keeping microeconomics and macroeconomics apart. Now, most macroeconomists think that macroeconomics should have micro foundations, but then there turn out to be multiple competing conceptions of what micro foundations should be. So this sure looks like an ontological problem, and it looks like ontological chaos, right? Just the sort of thing Brian thinks is pervasive in the absence of better metaphysical clarity. So you might think Epstein's program should cast some light here, right? This looks like a raging case of ontological confusion. Well, again, given more time, this is something I've argued extensively, discussed extensively in various pieces of work over the years. I don't think the issues here have anything to do with metaphysics. That is, in particular, they don't arise from atomism. Economists, even those who think they're atomists, basically almost never actually are. I mean, atomism is not a theme in economics. Nor does it have anything to do with confusions between anchors and grounds. The problems have to do with difficulties which are pervasive across the sciences, special sciences, difficulties in reconciling different statistical patterns that are generated by processes on different timescales. Again, this is a constant and recurrent actions, but when one tries to carefully, you work through these arguments, you work through the accounts of microfoundations, you work through the differences in different microfoundational programs and the different plausibility of different microfoundational applications, the kinds of issues Brian's talking about just never come up. There isn't confusion about what economic kinds are. I think it's very clear to me as an economist that there are no general fundamentality judgments governing economic model development. There's lots of specific ones, but no general ones that are applied across the board. In fact, we give advice to our PhD students in economics that could be glossed as don't do metaphysics, try and avoid it, right? But it's not, of course, how we say it to them. They wouldn't understand it. But what we say to things, we do say things to them like, don't imagine there's some grand theory of how an economy works that you can deploy to study some particular phenomenon. Or don't imagine that some model that works in some cases should work that way across other cases you haven't studied carefully. Or that there's always the same general way of applying a model from case to case. Avoid such deep generality assumptions. You just never know what's going to turn out to be fundamental relative to what in a case. So we could gloss that. Epstein does, don't do metaphysics, young economists. The opposite, in other words, of Epstein's advice. Now, Epstein says that at one point he says, if there's one principal moral of my book, so this is supposed to be the big takeaway if you forget all the rest of the details. Facts in the natural sciences, he says, are grounded differently from those facts in the, sorry, typo here. Facts in the social sciences, that should say. Social sciences are grounded differently from those in the natural sciences. Compared to the social sciences, the ontology of natural science is a walk in the park. Then he goes on to tell us why he thinks that the ontology of natural science is a walk in the park compared to the ontology of social science. He thinks this because he thinks natural objects are typically mainly intrinsically grounded. Now, at this point, he has come on to the ground where James and I live. We think that's absolutely false. I mean, it's one of the main burdens of our book is to argue against any such idea. So the part, as I say in the paper, this is more like a walk through South Park than Central Park. Okay, so in the remaining time, and how am I doing for time? I don't have a clock I can see. Oh, not so well for
10
time.
minutes left. Well,
Oh, that's not so bad. Okay, that's not so bad. I'm going to be a little bit tight, but all right. So the rest of the presentation is going to be about naturalized metaphysics. So I've criticized Brian on his, tried to criticize him on his own ground, show how he's also, however, committed to making some claims about ontology on the natural side. So now let me flesh out a little bit why I think he's absolutely wrong in his analysis of his main example, which is, I mean, his example of a natural science object that is intrinsically and easily grounded is a rock. A rock. It doesn't specify what kind of rock. That's an extraordinary example, I think. All right. In our book, we develop and defend a naturalized metaphysics. We argue that the point of such a metaphysics is to unify the special sciences with universal physics. By unify here, we don't mean the ambitious kind of program of the positivists. We certainly don't mean to reduce. We just mean tell a story about how there could be one world that is described both by the universal physics we actually have, and which doesn't involve individual objects, and then a whole bunch of special sciences that do traffic in individual objects. A universal physics where it's not clear that causation, metaphysically interpreted, is part of the story, versus a bunch of special sciences where causation is the main point of the exercise, just identifying causal relations, and so on. So unify here just means answer the dappled world defenders. We assume that universal physics applies generally but incompletely to reality, and that's why if there's a challenge here. There would be no point to the project if special science is reduced to universal physics, because then metaphysics would have nothing to add to science. Then or you could just say, well, our universal physics is our metaphysics, depending on what you want to mean by metaphysics. But the tide of scientific evidence hasn't been trending in this direction, right? It seems that it's progressively, reductionism gets less and less and less plausible as science advances. It's constantly populating the ontology, as opposed to simplifying it, reducing it, clearing it away. It's not producing Quine's desert landscapes, it's producing a lush rainforest kind of ontology, and that's why we call our ontology rainforest realism. And we try to make clear that ontic structural realism is our philosophy of science. It is not a metaphysics. Our metaphysics is that to be is to be a real pattern. Why do we call this construction metaphysics? Right? Certainly some philosophers would argue that whatever it is we're doing, it's not metaphysics, partly because we don't acknowledge foundations at all. We're skeptics about the idea that there are foundations. So why don't we, like Dewey and Rorty, just say we have no time for metaphysics? Well, we argue that explaining how the disconnected special sciences jointly construct a single reality is continuous with the project of traditional metaphysics, Aristotle's project. And crucially, this construction isn't the job of any special science. And it's not the job of universal physicists, precisely because reductionism doesn't work. So if the job is worth doing, it's going to have to be done by, well, somebody. And it seems to me, so there's a role for something that we think deserves reasonably can be called metaphysics. But we don't want to die on any semantic hills. So if somebody wants to, if an argument with another philosopher just comes down to whether what we are calling metaphysics deserves to be called metaphysics, we can make concessions there without caring very much. Now, what motivates the assumption that reality might be unifiable in our sense rather than dappled, as in the Cartwright-Dupre story? We argue the assumption that assumption, the non-dappled assumption, is reflected in actual scientific practice. That is, when models from different disciplines make contradictory claims, this is treated as a problem for scientists. And the problems, when they arise between special sciences, they typically generate cross-disciplinary standoffs. Unless the scientists can find something more general, I would argue, not fundamental, not more foundational, but something more general, maybe universal physics, maybe information theory, or principles of statistics, to try and actually shed light on their disagreement. And there's an asymmetry here. This is crucial. No special science is allowed to violate currently accepted generalizations of universal physics, but universal physicists aren't required to pay any attention to special sciences. And we think it's that asymmetry, the existence of that asymmetry in science, that is suggestive that scientists don't believe the world is dappled. And if scientists don't believe the world is dappled, neither should philosophers. Can we say at any scale, in general, what existence is across the scale, this scale relative set of scientific models? Well, we argue that it's to be an element of a maximally informationally efficient model of a kind of dynamical process, such that if that process is not attended to, if that model is not attended to, then the account of the world is incomplete, would be incomplete, even for an ideal observer, that is an observer who could check every possible, physically possible perspective across all those scales. Well, that's just pragmatism, that's Peirce, right? And notice that it has the ontology being defined by the scientific modeling practices. It's not instrumentalism, right? As arguably it is for William James. If it excludes some patterns that are useful to humans, that are worth tracking for specific human purposes, but would be informationally redundant to a better informed observer. That is, that if you just did more work or you had better epistemic access, you could see that those pragmatically useful patterns are dispensable. So that's why it's a kind of realism. I'm not going to go into the details of this slide. This is our actual theory of existence, right? To be is to be a real pattern, and here's a real pattern. This, James and I are still working on this. This is what's in our book, but we think it's inadequate in some respects. In particular, we think we need to replace the specification that's currently given in terms of a classical computation theory with more statistical and Bayesian picture. That is, we need to replace the classical computer that's doing the work here with a deep learning statistics computer, a statistical search machine. And we're working on a paper now that should be out later this year on that. But from the main philosophical point of view, the core of the thing still holds. How am I doing for time? It's 22. I'm going to stop here. I've got several more slides, but let me just go straight to big conclusions. it follows from our story that metaphysical atomism is false. OI in social science is unsustainable. So there we agree with Epstein, but also that there are no metaphysical constitution relations. No metaphysical foundations. So we deny that there are empirically supported general fundamentality relationships. Objects can sometimes be modeled as slow-moving processes. In other instances, they are modeled as the careers of objects. We reject the idea that there are general framing principles or metaphysically grounded social kinds. We can appeal to fellow pragmatists, right? Science doesn't know essence-accident distinction, and it doesn't know a substance-property distinction. We just don't find those encoded in scientific theories. So naturalized metaphysics shouldn't either. The last two slides are really an extension about statistics and person stuff. So I'll stop here for questions. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I couldn't quite squeeze it all in.
Thank you very much, Don. I mean, this was perfect in time, and to my mind, perfect as a claim about how we should approach these issues. And of course, I guess not everybody will agree, or there will be questions. So either raise your hand or put your name into the chat. Which Francesco.
Yeah, well, great talk as usual, but let me just ask you a question. I mean, I have a curiosity about your views about mathematics. I mean, there's no doubt that mathematics plays a really important role in science. But it seems to me that mathematics has a kind of double, obviously, it helps clarifying, it helps us represent or, keep track of patterns that otherwise would be very difficult to even talk about or conceive in using everyday language. So I take all that in. I mean, it also seems to me that mathematics sometimes is an impediment to the sort of things that philosophers or metaphysicians sometimes want to do, which is, to have the big picture. So at one point, you mentioned, the dappled world or the disunified view of science. I mean, one reason why science appears to be disunified is that it is sometimes extremely difficult to give mathematical representations of general phenomena that are not local. I mean, when you build a model for a local phenomenon, you do it usually by making lots of idealizing assumptions, simplifying assumptions, and so on and so forth. Then you have another model that applies to another local phenomenon. And then you ask, okay, how are these two models that seem to be somewhat inconsistent? How can they both be true? And you would like to have, the general theory that puts everything together, but then the mathematics becomes extremely complicated and nobody knows really how to do it. And, this is a very good point that many philosophers have done, that, in practice, it is often extremely difficult to give, mathematical representations of, general phenomena. I mean, you're lucky if you find one. I mean, not to speak of two or three. So that's when, even physicists, even scientists, shift to ordinary language, right? Because you cannot give a mathematical representation. So when you're trying to build bridges and to explain how it all hangs together, you resort to ordinary language, metaphors. You say, well, maybe one day we will find, a general theory that it will explain all this, but at the moment we have no idea how to do it. So I wonder whether you agree with this description and what you think that this implies for the project of metaphysics. I mean, because it seems to say that, at some level, ordinary language is the only option that we have to give a description of things that are extremely complicated mathematically.
Right. Okay. Let me answer. That's a great question, right? It goes right to the heart of a whole bunch of things. And so the answer is pretty complicated. And therefore I have a bunch of different possible strategies for approaching the answers. And I want to pick one that won't like take the whole rest of this session. So let me try it this way. Suppose we didn't have deep physics, right? Suppose there was no quantum theory and general relativity. Suppose all we had was a kind of applied physics and a bric-a-brac of local physical theories for different phenomena. So only the special science bits of physics. Then I think I would be completely persuaded by anti-metaphysicalism altogether. That is, and I'm not sure I don't think I'd embrace the dappled world. That is, I don't think I'd be wanting to go around and say, we've discovered that the world is dappled, because that's a metaphysical claim, at least as I understand when John Dupre says it. I think that's what he says, that's what he means. I would be with Rorty and say, forget about metaphysics, just drop it, right? It's not, you can't do it and it's not interesting. It's a hopeless enterprise. What keeps us from going there with him is I think there's a blind spot in that account, in Rorty's way of thinking about the world, which is because he doesn't appreciate the very different way in which mathematics is used in deep physics from the ways in which statistics are used or applied math is used in the special sciences. He thinks there's really, in the end of the day, only one way of apprehending reality, which is through natural language. And then the way in which metaphors are just irreducibly and irretrievably baked into natural language and gives rise to vagueness issues and gives rise to absence of any meta language, clearly preferred meta language you can go to resolve indeterminacy problems, and so on and so on and so forth, gets Rorty his anti-metaphysical skepticism. But when we look at, but there is deep physics. And I think, though I agree with everything you said, Francesco, about the hopelessness of trying to just go to mathematics to unify issues in special sciences. And you're absolutely right that what we do when we're trying to generalize there is we go to natural language because it's so difficult to construct a formalist or quasi-formal model there. But if we go to quantum theory, going to English or French when you're trying to do quantum theory is a disastrous strategy, right? Because what you're invariably doing when you do that is making what quantum physics is telling us is a really, really strange world. You're making it familiar again to some extent. You're going to be importing, you're domesticating metaphors into this really wild place you're in. Also, I think this is also really important, and this is, again, when you do math, if you're actually trying to do original mathematics, and this applies as much if you're doing economic theory as if you're doing physical theory, it's a different kind of cognition, right? Doing original math is use of, ultimately, you're trying to manipulate visual space, visual cognition. You have to kind of get natural language to go to sleep to do it well. Now, that's not something you don't sort of sit down at your desk and say, now I'm going to make natural language go to sleep. You do some math until it does go to sleep. And if you hit your stride, it's gone to sleep. And I think the anti-metaphysical pragmatists just don't appreciate that there's a couple of different ways of apprehending reality. And so my view is, if it's really that's why I think there's space for metaphysics. There's space for metaphysics because we have this alternative, which works somewhere, and it happens to work in the most general universal science we've got, which happens to work somewhere, that is an alternative to the language and all its special, with wonderful power, but also its special limitations.
Okay, thank you, Don. Perhaps one suggestion that you that we stop sharing the screen so we can see each other better. So that's perhaps a general. Yeah, thank you. general suggestions at the end of the talk, so that's easier for the discussion.
Good point.
Now,
Sorry.
I have a follow-up question myself, because I don't see any immediate question on the screen now, and that concerns the relationship to science when we do metaphysics of science. And the more I consider the science, the more I see disagreement in the science. So quantum physics is notorious. So when you make the claim there are no individual objects, Bohmians and part myself will contradict this. They can construct you a quantum theory, even a quantum field theory that solves the measurement problem, etc. And I guess if you go further, I mean, economics, I've not much of ideas of economics, but if I just observe superficially the debates among economists, it's getting worse there. So when there's no such thing as designs to base our metaphysics on, I guess. So we somehow have to go into the science and have to do some conceptual or a priori. So Olivier was I would say quite favorable or more favorable to that procedure of metaphysics than others. I'm more favorable for the simple reason that I don't that there is not the science as one monolithic block from which we can, on the basis of which we can do the ontology.
Right. Thanks for the question. Let me break it into two little bits. I think an easier thing, or well, something I can answer with far fewer words, and then I'll go to the physics. So on economics first, I mean, it's of course not my view that metaphysics helps with economics. I mean, that is all we're trying to do with metaphysics is explain how you could have a world as described by economics that's part of the same world as the world described by physics. So I'm not arguing that we should use metaphysics to do economics. But I don't agree with your claim that economics is a place of ontological chaos and deep disagreement. I think, right, there are deep problems in macroeconomics, and macroeconomists disagree furiously with each other because there is great uncertainty about how it should be done, and that has partly a lot to do with having far too much data, and too many data coming from too many different timescales and really deep issues, and knowing how to co-handle all those data. But microeconomics is a place of great calmness. The main things that microeconomists work on, like mechanism design and extensions of game theory to industrial organization, and there's very little disagreement. And there's lots and lots of engineering success. The fingerprints of microeconomists are all over the engineered social world. They tend to be kind of invisible because they work so well. So I just don't have the same vision of economics, and it's but our use of math and stats has a great deal to do with that control. It's a big part of the explanation of why it's so peaceful in micro is because of the clarity of our tools.
Okay, now, right. Not the same about the physics. I would say.
Physics, yeah.
With the tools,
totally different story in physics.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Don.
Here's what I say. James and I are real clear in the book that if we're wrong about quantum physics, and of course we can't know that we're right, we have an argument, and we know there's another side, like Bohmians, for example, as you said, who have a different view. If we're wrong about quantum physics, then our position's gone. I mean, we have to hold that ground. We think we're right about quantum physics, but so all of this, I'm happy to say, our whole story is hostage to our being right about physics. So for us, these issues in philosophy of physics are indeed fundamental. Now, the next issue then is, are the arguments in philosophy of physics, are they metaphysical arguments, or are they scientific arguments? It seems to us ultimately they're scientific arguments, right? We don't think of ourselves as doing metaphysics when we're doing philosophy of physics. So, but if we're wrong about the philosophy of physics, then our story about metaphysics will fall apart.
Okay, Thank you. Now there's time for one further quick question. Or we have, if there's no further urgent question, then we can thank Don and allow us 4 minutes of break until Raphael's talk, if this is fine. Okay. Thank you very much, Don. Very short coffee break, and then we start again in 4 minutes.
Great. Thanks. Thank you.
Michael, you're now the administrator of the whole session. So if it breaks, you're...
Yeah, but there should be a second person. And the simple reason is that I'm a theoretician, so I can follow even Don on the use of mathematics. But if I have to manipulate an informatics tool, something may go wrong. So
Don is also co-host, but
but you can. Why can't you be co-host yourself, Raphael?
Okay. Do I have to relinquish the hosting? Do I do that?
Can you just allow me to share my screen, because I didn't want to...
Oh, am I the host? I see. Okay, I didn't know I was the host.
No, I did not tell you. So you're like the security.
I just released the screen share.
Yeah, thank you.
Now?
Yeah, it works. Thank you.
Okay. 3 minutes break.
Does it work? Do you see it? Yeah, I think it works.
Everything fine, Raphael. So
Sounds good. Seems good. Okay, see you soon. I should try.